convicted abusers are saying that they didn't have to do the grooming because the grooming was already done for them by society. And what that means, Gail Dines is a very outspoken person on this topic, and she addresses this specifically in regards to pornography. But girls specifically feel, and I'm sure in the gay male community as well, that if they don't look as though they're ready for sex, then they're boring or worse, like invisible. In order to get attention, they need to be in this kind of pornified style.
As a young mother, I experienced a paradigm shift that transformed how I saw education and ultimately the world around me. I started this podcast, The Luminous Mind, to connect with and learn from people who are disrupting the status quo in how they learn, educate, and live in the world around them. Prepare for a paradigm shift. Light a candle, light your world.
Benjamin Franklin said, "Instead of cursing the darkness, light a candle." You're listening to The Luminous Mind with your host, Rebecca Bowman.
This is a disclaimer. This information that we discuss with Emily Gaudreau is very sexually sensitive. If you have small children in the room, I would recommend that you wait to listen to this podcast at a time when you can be without little children in the room and when you're able and ready to discuss these topics with them. Today's fire starter is Emily Gaudreau. Emily, a former Playboy photographer, is now an anti-porn activist and a sexual abuse prevention educator. She is a woman on a mission to stop the cycle of sexual trauma and opening our eyes to the high price we're paying for a pornified culture. Emily is the host of the To Raise A Maverick podcast. Welcome, Emily.
Hello, how are you?
I am so good. I am so excited to have you be part of our podcast because, like I was telling you before we even start recording, that your message, just the fact that you come at sex education for our children and all of that abuse from kind of a different angle, like this non-religious angle, I find it very interesting because sometimes I feel like if we come at sex ed and sex abuse and stuff like that from a religious angle, that we end up having kind of an ulterior motive. And so I like yours because it's very plain spoken, and I feel like your message helps people better understand why this is so important. And I think it reaches a broader audience. So I'm so excited to have you with us. But before we get into any of that kind of stuff, though, let's first talk about yourself. Just introduce yourself to us and tell us who you are and what you do for all your passions and work.
Yeah, so thank you. I'm super excited. My name's Emily Gaudreau. I'm a sex abuse prevention expert, and I help parents protect their kids from sexual abuse. And kind of my specialty is talking about pornography. And I used to be a Playboy photographer, so that kind of gives me a little bit of clout. And I mean, day to day, my secret obsession is feeding my squirrels. I know that sounds crazy, but I have a small herd, and they come up and crawl on me. My husband's like, "You're like a creepy Disney princess," and I'm like, "I'm gonna own that." Yeah, so I'm a mom, I'm a stepmom, I'm a godmother, a dog mom, and I'm just super passionate about creating interesting conversations about sex and sex education. And just a little insight into me, kind of a funny thing when we go to dinner, and I'm not one. I'm definitely an introvert, or I love to social isolation is like my MO. So when I go out, my husband's like, "Emily, do not ask my boss if he watches pornography." I'm like, "Well, if it comes up, I don't know. It's an interesting conversation." And he's like, "Emily, no." Okay.
That's interesting. Well, yeah. I'd love to hear more of your background and why you're so driven to really talk about pornography and positive sex education for our kids. You mentioned kind of, and we talked about it in your bio a little bit, that you were a Playboy photographer, but what's the background to that?
So, I've dug into this quite a bit as well, because a lot of times people who have mad passion for something, it's such a pile of different things. And going back, one of my best friends in elementary school was sexually abused by her mom.
Ooh.
And it's taken me a while to kind of dissect this stuff, like all the things that come together that make us who we are and what's, driven us. But she, would tell me things that had happened, and she was, more physically mature than me. She was kind of an early bloomer. This is from like 2nd to 6th grade, basically.
Oh.
But most of this happened around, I'd say 5th grade. And she would say, her mom was doing these things because she was so much more mature. And I remembered so specifically being jealous. And this is very interesting, right? Being jealous because she was more popular, she was more physically mature, and that was part of like a rite of passage. That is how uneducated we were about what was going on. And if somebody had told us, if we had had one mention of abuse prevention and sex ed in 5th grade, she would not have spent the trajectory of her life continuing to deal with that. I mean, she went on to, she was very, I don't know what the right word is, but extremely sexual throughout school.
Promiscuous, maybe.
Promiscuous, yes, that's the right word. And she actually went on to be a stripper, and like, it's classic. It's a classic case of abuse that wasn't
dealt with, right?
Dealt with, right.
Yeah.
So that's part of it. And then also, I think the main catalyst where I was like having a major wake up call was when I was actually on a photo shoot with Playboy, and I worked for Rachel Ray. I worked for all the major news sources. I did documentary photography. I worked for ad agencies. I photographed Bill Gates. And then I took this job with Playboy to photograph an event, super tame. I kid you not, like your high school prom is 100% crazier than this stuff. It was just basically the girls in their bunny suits walking around signing stuff for guys. Anyways, I'm photographing, and that's not justifying why. I mean, I shouldn't have been there, but just so people always wonder, they're like, what crazy thing happened? The crazy thing that happened is I was photographing these girls smiling, holding, the things that they were signing for the guys. And I just caught a glimpse of a look in one of the girls' eyes, and it just rocked me. It even got like, I'm getting choked up now. And I went home, I edited the photos, and I put the stuff, I gave them their images, and I put my camera away, and I have never picked it up again.
Wow.
And the short story long, she had been sexually abused. And now that I work with people who have been sexually abused, there is a look in their eyes that is absolutely undeniable. And that's what I was seeing. And I think it was just, it was a call, like higher calling, waking me up to what I was doing. I was perpetuating abuse of this person.
That's interesting. I think a lot of what you say, like, we never hear about sexual abuse by a mom. That's interesting. It's usually a father or a weird uncle or a priest or something like that. But yeah. So from the time that you put down your camera and decided not to do that anymore, and you notice that look in their eye, like, how has your thought process, like, basically, what was your thought process that kind of, there's always things that lead us to what you're doing now with like How to Raise a Maverick and all of that kind of stuff. What's like the background to that? Like, where did that story, from putting down that camera to now, how has that led you?
I think it was, an intellectual development as well, understanding that I had bought into this feminist myth that sex workers, that was part of feminism, is like supporting sex workers, that they could do and be whatever they want. And, in all honesty, they can, but the more I worked more I saw around that, I realized that the decision for these people to be there, 90% of people who work in the sex industry have been sexually abused as children. So is that really a choice for them to be there? If like the choice was made for them when they were kids, they were split off on a trajectory early on. So I think that was part of it. And then launching How to Raise a Maverick really started when I had my daughter, and well, I'll be honest, it's when I got married and I had stepkids. And when you have stepkids, everybody out there who has them knows if they have their birth parents, those are the people in charge of raising them, really. Mm-hmm. And there was just things going on that I felt like I couldn't address. And I felt like if that's not my place with the stepkids, I'm going to create a platform where I'm going to help other people.
That's interesting, because sometimes when we in divorce and we have like the step parent comes involved and the mother's dating and all that stuff, that opens up kids for abuse as well, right? Like the more we expose kids to different adults in their life like that and bring them in and out of the home. Is that what you're meaning, like with the stepkids? Like okay.
They are 20 times more likely to be sexually abused.
Wow.
20 times. And that is higher than kids in the foster care system. And this is, people do not, and a lot of moms are really worried about their husbands and what their husbands are doing. And I am here to tell you that moms need to be unbelievably careful about the men that they bring into their lives. And it's not just boyfriends. I mean, these are people that the mothers marry. Mm-hmm. Story after story after story of people coming forward saying that they were, just all kinds of horrific things happen at the hands of the people that their mother chose to commit their lives to. It's, and I have to say this, is if you can work on your marriage, is the best thing you can do to protect your kids from sexual abuse.
Strong marriages. I agree. I think it's a powerful place to keep, kids healthy in that strong marriage, for sure.
There's so much. And sexual predators seek out single moms. Mm-hmm. And I know this sounds, if I had to go, into the dating scene again, which I hope I don't, it would be a long time before I even said that I had a daughter.
Yeah. Keep it on the low down.
Yeah. Because they're sought after for their children. And now with the quantity of sharing on social media, they can see what your kids look like and who your kids are. And it's just seriously, 20 times, they're 20 times more likely.
Yeah. Well, and sexual predators will use like social media to find children as well. We hear, all those stories about like my daughter, she might be on Instagram or something like that. And somebody would notice that she's maybe younger and then, try to become friends with them and try to portray themselves as another 15, 16-year-old person and then try to make a meetup, right? That's really common for
all day long, all night long. So like when I just saw somebody like gave their little 5-year-old daughter, but the problem with the phones as well is this is what I tell people. It's like, would you let the whole, like anybody in the world come into your home? And that's exactly what you do when you with the social media stuff, and kids are wicked smart. They will, my gosh, you can only imagine how crazy I am. Our stuff is crazy, crazy lockdown.
Really?
Does my daughter, she's 7 years old, does she find stuff? Oh yeah, she finds stuff all the time. And I'm like, and I'm nuts. I'm nuts about this stuff.
Really?
Yeah. It's just really, she does not have her own phone, but this is just even on Netflix and stuff like that.
Yeah.
They bypass stuff so quick. And my version of G is definitely different than G and PG that's of other, ratings. Yeah.
That's interesting. I'd like to maybe talk more about that later on. I have almost the opposite approach of like, and my audience is going to think I'm maybe irresponsible, but I'm like, okay, I want to open, but stuff that we can talk about. But it hasn't always worked out well for us. all I can say. So, but I'd like to kind of go back. You were talking about that friend that had been abused and those muration. We all had those, what will I call them? Muration. That's wrong. The 5th grade movie where the girls get pulled in and they're taught about their bodies and all of that. So we've gone from a place where as we come into womanhood with ourselves, we all had that video. And so we went from a place of like, our parents never talked about, I'm assuming you're somewhat close to my same age, like our parents just never talked about sex. We never talked about, and I know there was a lot of sexual abuse going on. I experienced some, and I know I have many friends that did too, but then we've kind of crossed over to this place, like we're talking about it, but it's not necessarily, I don't feel like it's in a healthy way. How do you feel like your message of sex education is like different from what other people are saying?
Well, I mean, it's interesting.
Well, we have two different realms, right? We have the Christian thing. It's like, it's bad, and you shouldn't do it, versus like, the queens have, a free for all of like, let your children, I don't know, sit on a transvestite's lap or whatever and read books to them. You know what I mean? There's two ends of the spectrum.
So the best way to understand it is to look at the history of sex education in the United States. Basically, after World War II, a lot of the soldiers came back and STDs were becoming a lot more prevalent. So that's when the government stepped in and was like, all right, we're going to need to start educating about STDs. And previous to that, it was more of a morality discussion. Then it went into a little bit more of the basically you're a tainted person forever if you have a disease, and like scaring the crap out of everybody.
Or it's all the woman's fault. I mean, there was a lot of that.
There's all kinds of stuff like that. And then in 1964, we were talking about how we can't pronounce last names, but Mary Calderon, I think is how you say it.
Yeah, that sounds right.
She was a physician at Planned Parenthood, and she founded the Sexual Information and Education Council, and that and the American Hygiene Association came together. So what's happened is we have now this mix of like how babies are made, how to prevent STDs, and then the Sexuality Information Council is really strongly pushing for inclusivity in regards to the LGBTQ plus community. So there's that piece of it. And what's happened is Planned Parenthood is one of the major contributors to sex ed, especially for the public schools, as is the LGBT plus community. So, especially when I was working with Playboy, I worked with another company called Self Serve, and that was a sex positive sex store. And it was a really good introduction to me of what sex positive is. And it's a really great thing for adults. It's amazing. It's no shame. It's not this creepy sex store. It's more, obviously more open about masturbation and stuff like that. It's great for adults. So what they're doing now, and as parents out there are kind of thinking about the sex ed stuff for their kids, when they see something that says sex positive, this sounds great, or like pleasure positive or no shaming or anything like that. Like, yes, all of that sounds great, but these are very loaded phrases, because what they're doing is they're creating inclusivity, which also sounds really good, into the pleasure aspect. So what happens is we're opening up to the world of kink. So this goes beyond LGBT sexual behaviors and like on the entry level, let's call it that. And like whatever you want, whatever feels good for you. Now, 80 years ago, that might have been fairly limited. Now we have things like cutting, choking, fisting. These are all like, I just label this stuff as kink, which as an adult, there's no judgment, whatever you guys want to do on your own time, but always remember we're talking about children. So this is what is getting entered into the sex education system. And you're like, oh, Emily, that's not true. It totally is. And the first time I heard it, I was like, there's no way. Like, I'm not buying that. That's not happening in the schools. It absolutely is. And this is the way it's happening. One, the teachers are required to answer every single question that the kids, they write anonymous questions and they give them to the teacher. They're required to answer these questions, whether they do or not. Like that's the premise, is answering all of these sex ed questions. Well, these kids are also watching sex, or I'm not watching. Of course watching porn, and all kinds of other things that fall under that category. And that's the information that they're bringing to the table and asking questions to be brought into that educational platform to be talked with that teacher.
That's interesting.
Yes. So the pornography piece is like creating a lot of lack of clarity in regards to sex education because of that.
Yeah. Well, and if we go back to the history of sex education, I mean, I think I want to be like really clear, like, you know, I think in some ways we moved positively in the fact that, like you said, that there's that feminist component maybe of like the no shame and making, because it was all of the decisions about how a man behaves sexually was pinned onto a female, which, you know, we all know that it's not necessarily our problem, but we're taking that no shame thing and like directing it on kids. We talked about before we even began, like, you know, I've done a lot of stuff in scouting, and they do a whole section on how to keep kids safe, and they talk a lot about grooming. And do you feel like that what we're doing now with kids, we're almost grooming them to be victims? Like you said, like this whole kink idea of like whatever feels good, it almost sounds like it's almost very brutal, like painful, violent, stuff like that. Like most people wouldn't sign up for just like on their own unless they were groomed to believe it was okay. Does that make sense? Like,
yeah, exactly. Well, there's a couple things. So a lot of pedophiles or sexual abuse, I mean, not all, you don't have to be a pedophile to abuse kids, but convicted abusers have said that kids are coming to them already groomed. They don't have to groom because society has already done it. There's a gal named, her last name is, I think it's Gail.
Can you say that again? Sorry.
Yeah. Convicted abusers are saying that they didn't have to do the grooming because the grooming was already done for them by society. And what that means, Gail Dines is a very outspoken person on this topic, and she addresses this specifically in regards to pornography. But girls specifically feel, and I'm sure in the gay male community as well, that if they don't look as though they're ready for sex, then they're boring, or worse, like invisible. In order to get attention, they need to be in this kind of pornified style. And a lot of the stuff that I teach in my courses is like helping parents and adults understand the pornification. You know, we have like Rolling Stones is a good example, and they've done studies of this, the change over the past 20 years and the difference between sexy versus pornified. And, you know, pornified is very much ready for sex look. And girls are taught that they're not going to be acknowledged unless they're in that form, which I think is, you know, a lot of if you notice the girls, like if you were just a high school or a college campus or something like that, there really are several different realms and varying degrees in between of girls who are like going the opposite direction of that. Like they're cutting their hair off, which is fine. I mean, I have my hair cut, but it's like this, I do not want to be sexualized. And the only way for me to be and not be sexualized is to go to this extreme side. And then you've got the others that are also like fully in on that and look like they're very, very sexualized, you know?
Yeah. That's interesting. Two different types. I'm going to write this down. Yeah. That's something I want to talk to you about too. But I'd love to know, like, what do you feel like, and we talked about that broad spectrum of sex ed where we have this right Christian, like, don't do it, all this shaming going on, to this pornified, you know, side of, you know, all the kink that we're teaching kids. How do you feel like what you're trying to teach is a challenge to maybe those two different models, those traditional models? And what, as you're trying to discover how to teach, you know, this positive sex ed, what challenges have you come upon with that?
Well, the biggest thing is that I believe in is authentic sexuality, and that is allowing a person to authentically come into who they are truly going to be. So this does not work well with a hardcore Christian community, which I am a Christian, so I understand that side very well.
But even Christians don't understand. Sorry, I did not mean to interrupt you, because I don't. But they don't even understand, like, the whole shaming thing actually creates a lot of problems with, even if they, save themselves for marriage and they end up getting married to that one person. That's the only person they've had. It creates like this. They feel almost dirty about sex, and then they can't have like this really great relationship with their spouse, right? Like,
right,
I mean, that's really some of the downsides of that. Anyway,
yes.
But go ahead.
Yeah, well, that's the other part of it too, is it's like the no sex before marriage thing. Well, the reality is like, I hope people have sex. I hope they have great, wonderful, loving sex with people who are they're in like loving long-term relationships, and it's consensual and beautiful, and they can explore and do, whatever crazy things they want to within that. And with the Christian community, it's, no sex before marriage, which really, is stifling for their ability to have those conversations, because they feel like they're encouraging kids to have sex. And then the other side of the argument is the people who are really pushing back against that religious influence, because of the LGBT community has been, been ostracized out of that, is not accepted by the Christian community in various degrees here and there. So on that side, there's this desire to be so inclusive that they have lost the division between adult and child appropriate sexual actions or engagement.
That's interesting. Yeah, because, and maybe in an effort to not feel so, about mental health, basically, with the LGBTQ plus whatever, their feeling is it's all done in a realm to help children's mental health, right? Like that they don't grow up feeling ashamed about who they are and how they feel different ways, but it's being taken like too far. Do you feel like that's the case?
Yeah. Basically what's happening is the Christian community is doing their best to make sure nobody has sex before marriage. And there's some that are very afraid that their kids will join the LGBTQ plus community. So what they're doing is they're really hampering authentic sexuality. They're like, this is how you will be. This is how we want you to be. And then on the other side, it's done in a similar way, where they're like, you can be this, you can be that, instead of just going, these are the facts. We're not going to talk about introducing you as this is an option for you. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
One is very restricted, and the other is like, here's a billion different ways you can be sexually with another human being. Where my fight with both of them is, my desire is to have kids fall in love with somebody, have like basic knowledge on how to stay safe, and find out who they are within that like amazing, cool, crazy relationship. Not, I heard about this, and this is what other people are doing, this is what's normal. Like, no, what is normal for you? And if your child is gay or trans or on any of that, the goal is for them to have come to that on their own without influence.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense. What we deal with now is pornography is wildly influential. And then societally, we have this like massive, like, the story time, the drag queen story time and stuff like that, where it's this over acceptance, which means blurring the lines between adult entertainers and children.
Yeah. And having them sit on their laps and stuff like that. That's just weird. I don't know.
People are so concerned about being accepting that they have absolutely lost the plot.
Yeah.
I love drag queens. I love drag kings. And there's I will go out of my way to go and watch those shows. I drink a ton. They're extremely crude, over the top, raunchy sexual shows. And a lot of people do not understand that. That is an adult entertainment. It's over the top. I've been at shows where I walked out because I was like, this is just like, they're just trying to be offensive. But it's fun. It's adult fun. It's adult entertainment.
That's interesting. Yeah.
It is not for children. And I'm on one of my Facebook posts, there's a drag king or queen, and she's like, these white middle-aged women are so afraid of, being anti-LGBT that they're like bringing their kids. And he said, do not bring your children around us. The gay community is constantly being combined with the pedophiles. We do not bring your children around us. Don't put that on us.
Yeah.
It's not who we are.
But it sounds like parents aren't like really listening. So
no, you know what it is? They don't get it because this is new for them.
Yeah, that's true.
They need to be a little bit less prude and go and explore this stuff on their own. A lot of people talk about stuff that they don't know about. They're like, oh, this is supporting the gay community. No, it's not. Like, first of all, those are not necessarily gay people. Like, how are you to label their sexual preference because they dress up as women? No. Yeah. And plus they're not, and this isn't trans either. These people are not, or cross-dressing or whatever. Drag kings and queens are very different. It's like they're strippers ish. It's adult entertainment 100%.
That's interesting. Well, and I feel like the religious right and all the, going back to our history, when men came home from the war, I've been reading a lot about how they were so worried about women being, now that they've been out in the workforce and all that stuff, like not returning to their proper place,
right.
but I almost feel like because of this feeling of wanting to keep those gender roles going and the religious right and all that stuff and squash feminism, that kind of thing, that it's just a natural pushback, right? Like there's this natural rebellion that's happening, and that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing people that were kind of raised in that religious right, the shaming and all of that kind of stuff, and now as parents they're almost like pushing it to the other side because they don't want to. They're trying to be so not like, and so I really am a believer in natural rebellion. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about constructive ways to parent, but it's just an interesting concept to think about. We don't really understand what we're trying to do when we're trying to be inclusive and how we're exposing our children to stuff. Like, what are some common mistakes, kind of to go into that you feel like parents are making in protecting their children? What's some essential things to talk to your kids about?
I think one of the biggest misconceptions is, in regards to the topic that I specialize in, is that everybody thinks that pornography is a boy's issue. That watching pornography,
it's interesting.
We really, that's how can I, they'll have 3 girls and 1 boy. How can I talk to my boy about pornography? And I'm like, no. Let's go back. Let's talk to all of your kids. There is not male, female disparate. They're both exploring that for sure, without a doubt. So that's one of the biggest things. And I think the other thing is when you're out, sex education right now, because of the fact of pornography, which I'm sorry, it stinks. Like, this is just a reality of parenting right now. If you care about your child and want to have them be mentally healthy and happy, you got to start addressing this stuff from, as far as I'm concerned, from day one. And even as early, before they can even talk. This is going to sound a little weird, but I really would like parents to start using the anatomically correct words the day the kids are born. And the reason for that is not because the kids hear it. It's because we have so much shame and so much stuff tied up in our own sexuality. And you'll notice it. I notice it too. And it's weird. There's weird stuff that comes up that is a trigger for all of us. And you don't know until you've got a kid and you're like, whoa, I'm super triggered by that. I didn't know that was there. Hello. But it gives you a period of time to get to work through that. Can I say penis, vulva, whatever, easily? And if you can't, dive into that. Like, why? What happened? How it's just a part of the body. And another thing that I'm a little bit of a stickler on, when we talk about the female anatomy, the external anatomy is a vulva, and the internal, like vaginal canal, is the vagina. And a lot of people are like, oh, we like the word vagina. And I'm like, okay, well, that's like calling a penis a urethra or a mouth a tongue. It's, and it's very important to me, because that is where all the sexual pleasure organs are on a woman or a girl, or on females. So even in diagrams, and they have the Me Too movement and stuff like that, they have, it looks like the University of Texas hook 'em horns, like bull with the vagina going down. And I'm like, are you serious? We have these feminists out there about, like preaching women's rights and stuff like that, and they're not even including the whole anatomy.
That's interesting.
It's just the sexually reproductive parts that have been represented in our medical textbooks for eons.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, kids, they'll talk about with boys, ejaculation and erection and things like that, but nobody talks about vaginal wetness. Nobody talks about the female response to pleasure, or, those things happening to our bodies at all. Feminists, even in like people who consider themselves feminists.
And that's probably has something to do with the fact that we don't think girls are even thinking about that,
Right.
Kind of goes back to that whole idea of, I don't know, that girls somehow were holier than men or something that we don't think about. Or, yeah, exactly. So,
and it's really talking to girls about the blood flow to the genitals. I'm going to kind of segue back to pornography, because that's what, like I said, my husband's always, please don't talk about pornography. And I'm like, I can't stop. So something that's really interesting that happens, it's called arousal non-concordance. And they did a test, I think it was Manchester Metropolitan University did a study on it. And they tested men and women's response to pornography by the blood flow to their genitals. And then they had like a little buzzer that they would buzz if they were aroused mentally, if they felt like they were aroused to what they were seeing. And with women, there's only a 20% alignment. So only 20% of the time their genitals were aligned with their own desire. And with men, there's only a 50%. Now, this is super, super crucial when talking to kids about pornography, because our bodies are designed to have blood flow to the genitals whenever we see something sexual, period. It's not something like, oh, this turns me on, this is what I'm into, this is something I want to participate in. This is really important discussion, twofold, and it's deep. This is like a hard one to have. I get it. But it's important, because if kids understand that if they were sexually abused and they understand that their body responded in an autonomic response, that's crucial information.
Well, yeah, I mean, I remember feeling like, okay, no, this isn't right. But then you have like, well, but I got, stimulated by that, basically. Mm-hmm. And so like the victim doesn't feel like they can say that was wrong. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly. It's used against them. And I'll tell you guys in just a second how to talk to your kids about this in an easy way. But it is the number one thing. I interview therapists. I'm like, okay, what's the one thing that you have people coming back for 40, 50, 60 years after being sexually abused as a child that they can't get over? And that is the one thing that there was a response. They physically responded, ejaculation, orgasm, or just the fact that it felt good, or it was used against them. Now, the other part of this is when we talk about pornography, same thing. You're whatever age, you're 12, you're exploring pornography online, you see a rape scene, and your body is going to respond. You're going to get blood flow to the genitals. or you see a scene of a mix of different type of people, or, something that you've never been exposed to, whether or not that is your authentic sexuality or not, you are going to get blood flow to your genitals.
So is that the danger though? Like if you experience like watching that kind of stuff, you end up wanting more violence or whatever? Is that okay?
Yeah, totally. So what ends up happening is if you don't understand the biology of that autonomic response, just like we get goosebumps, our heart beats, we cough, sneeze, all these different things. When you see violence mixed with sexuality or any of these other things, you go, oh, this is who I am.
That's interesting. When it's really just a natural response to anything sexual is what you're trying to say. Like
exactly. And it's very confusing. So a lot of times we have parents, and I mean, this happens all the time. Whenever I go to conferences, somebody always pulls me aside and says, Emily, oh my gosh, specifically it's usually the daughters. I think it's kind of a head trip because we don't talk about this with the girls, thinks that they're lesbian or bi or whatever, and they've been watching pornography. This can be, not always, but can be where the confusion comes in, because they're not going, oh, I'm in a relationship or I am sexually attracted to a person. They are watching pornography and being turned on. And this is wildly dangerous for all kinds of reasons. Pornography, the porn industry, they've nailed it. They mix that blood flow to your genitals with violence. You're like, this is who I am. This is what I have to have. And then guess where else you can get that? Nowhere. Unless you commit crimes and rape and do these other things. You're not going to have that experience anywhere except for the product that they're selling and giving you.
That's interesting.
Yes.
And so then it just keeps you coming back for more because of that. So
because you can't get anywhere else.
Yeah. So there are two different realms that we're going here. We're talking about, sexual education, and then we're also talking about sexual abuse and that grooming that goes on. What do you think is like an essential thing for us to tell our kids about strangers? We always talk about like, don't, because I think so many of us are worried about that. We're worried about, I know one of the key points that you talked about, or, that you feel comfortable to talk about is how, I love that question. What's the false information that sex trafficking is dramatically reducing our kids' quality of life? But, as parents, we're worried about like kind of both ends of the spectrum of proper sexual education mixed with like also keeping our kids safe from being, sex predators. What do you think is essential about that?
Okay, so this is good. And I also remind me to go back because I want to tell everybody how to talk to their kids about arousal non-concordance. Like you can talk to your 2-year-old about it in this tricky way that I have. So,
okay.
So stranger danger. So there's 800,000 reported cases of missing children every year. And I don't have the stats in front of me, but I think it's like 98% of them are non-custodial parent abductions. So
you said what percentage? 80?
I think it's 98. It's like 98 or 99 or like 99.8, something like that. Like obviously like a very large amount are non-custodial parent abductions and runaways. So the thing that you need to understand about this is the kids that are being trafficked are not being reported missing. And there's so much fear going on about stranger danger, and we've proven time and time again that the statistically kids being abducted is like it's like 1% of all the cases of missing kids, and they get it sounds like I'm doing a lot of the 99 stuff, but they literally get 99% of them back. So the problem that we are dealing with sex trafficking is an entirely separate issue. These are kids, the LGBT plus community is at high risk because the kids get kicked out of their house.
Okay.
So they're runaways, which is another reason we need to, be really careful about as, for me as a Christian, I can talk about this, but as Christians, to really accept our children, and be there for them and love them and all of that. They go into seriously high risk once they leave the home.
Well, and those types of children are somewhat, they find somebody who will take care of them, and then that person kind of feeds on them, right? Like, I mean,
oh yeah,
they're somewhat compliant in the situation, maybe. Like, it's not.
Yeah, they need an advocate. They need somebody who understands them and accepts them for who they are, and entry into, somebody who's like, we get you, welcoming into whatever community. It's very, very dangerous for them if somebody gets a hold of them. Anyways, that's where a lot of the sex trafficking happens. Also within the foster system, the kids are actually purchased, and this has been, they're trying to get this. It's so underground and creepy and terrible, and so few people are willing to admit this, but someone will come in and say, we're trying so hard to adopt and we're having a hard time because of this and that. Adoption, there have been a significant amount of stories of the adoption parents saying that the kids run away, and they're basically given like a couple grand to say that the child has run away, so this family can have the child that they've always wanted but couldn't do it through the system.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, deep and not great. And then also a lot of the trafficking is happening by boyfriends. And the complexity of the sex trafficking is that one of the hardest parts is once the kids are saved, and we're talking like, teenagers or anything like that, it's difficult to keep them from going back to the person that was selling them.
Yeah. Well, like you said, I mean, that's the whole like porn industry, and all of that is fueled by people who have already been abused and who maybe find comfort in that, that situation. And then it's hard to break that cycle of abuse, right? Like,
yeah. And like the brainwashing that goes on. I mean, if sex traffickers could just grab people off the street and sell them, it doesn't happen that way. And they don't have the bandwidth to control somebody that isn't voluntarily there. And that, guess what? They don't have to. There are people who are voluntarily participating in it because they need help, they need support, they need community.
Yeah. Watch Jeffrey Epstein's thing, right? Like,
yeah.
I mean, that was mind blowing to me. Like, the girls, like, they knew it was wrong, but then there were so many ways that he was supporting them too, that.
Oh yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's not kids just being ripped off the street. And here's the problem with it is, as women and mothers and just parents in general, we're told that if we let our kids out of our sight for a second, that we're terrible parents, and they literally will come and take your kids away from you. So Utah now has a free range parent law to protect parents who let their kids walk to school. Lenora Skenazy,
I love her.
Yes. Yeah. She's the one that kind of heads that, and she's just brilliant and very outspoken about it. And as mothers and parents, it's wicked hard right now. And we can't even let our kids go out and play in the yard.
Yeah. And then with COVID on top of it, it's like,
Oh yeah. You let your kids go outside. They should be out riding their bikes. My daughter rides her bike like 8 hours a day, and we live in this kind of smaller community. She's literally out all the time. She comes back in like every 30 to 20 minutes and checks in.
Just because they want to, right? I mean, like, that's a natural thing for kids. My kids come find me all the time. Like, oh, hey, Mom, I just want to make sure you're still here.
Yeah, totally. So, I think people are so freaked out about the sex trafficking, and, you need to follow the numbers too, that if you're hearing these numbers, who's giving this data out? And most of the time it'll go back to a nonprofit that's asking for money, which is fine. Like, that's how it works. But just be wise. 800,000 missing kids a year. Everybody's like, oh my gosh, that's not true. Like, what's happening? Where are all these kids? I'm like, they're at home with their parents, actually.
But they never report that. And that's probably part of that 24-hour news cycle. Like, there's never that. Right. There's never, I mean, we hear the first part, but we never hear like the end of the story type of thing. And yeah. So, totally. And isn't it safer nowadays? I mean, I know Lenore Skenazy talks a lot about this. Like, we are actually safer. Our kids are much safer than they were back in even when I was growing up in the 1970s.
Yeah, so
nowadays.
that is overall safety is. I always go on the FBI sites. That's where I get that's probably one of the few sites that I actually trust on all of this, which who knows how trustful that is as well. But it's up and down. I mean, this is my problem with statistics always is usually is like a 10-year span before good stats come out. And 10 years, I mean, we're in a different world.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of the stats that say it's safer, I don't know. I'm not 100% sure it is. It's more, let me put it this way. You are more likely to be hurt by your family members than anybody
or your
else.
priest or someone that your scout leader.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Even like they do stuff on Halloween and stuff like that. And it's like these, finding razor blades and stuff like that. You trace those true stories back and it's like, oh, the uncle was dealing drugs and, the kid accidentally overdosed on stuff at his house. So he put drugs in the candy and that's where that story came from.
Oh, that's interesting.
Just stuff like that. So I'm is it safer now? According to some statistics, it is, and it isn't. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, like, growing up in the 1970s where there was a lot of sexual abuse by family members or whatever, I think that us as our generation is a little more aware that kind of stuff can happen and that's not just some, like my mom was fully aware that stuff was going on. And she's like, oh, that, your grandpa's just a dirty old man or something like that. Yeah. But like, we are like, nobody does that, that's wrong. And, so I think maybe we're just the generation that's more aware. And so that we're more cautious about stuff like that maybe. And then that leads into like the whole, sex trafficking. And I mean, we build stuff up in our mind. Maybe we just have more anxiety about stuff or different things like that. So as we're teaching our children about, healthy sexuality and all that kind of stuff, you mentioned that, teaching your kids sexual arousal at a really young age, give us the reasons why. That's so important stuff.
So like I was talking about with the arousal non-concordance and the importance of understanding, kind of our autonomic response to witnessing something sexual, it helps so much with, like I said, kids understanding, heaven forbid they are ever sexually abused. They have the understanding that their body response was not in alignment with their choice. And then also if they do watch pornography, that is not who they are just because their body responded. But I wanted to tell you, this is how I teach it. So everything I teach goes back to nature. And most of the activities you do like outside. So it's a game called A Mind of Its Own. And it's just bear with me. It sounds like, because we're talking about sex stuff, it sounds like people's brains go whatever. So what you do is you just get like a piece of grass and somebody closes their eyes and you tickle their nose or their face until they sneeze or they twitch or their arms until they get goosebumps. And so when you've got littles, all you do is go, isn't that weird? Our body is responding and we can't stop it. We don't have any control over it. Your body has a mind of its own. And I call it a conversation seed. So that's your first introduction into the conversation that we don't have control over how our bodies respond to certain things. And then as they get older, there'll be moments in time where you're like, you can point it out and it's just one of those like ongoing kind of noticing things that'll happen. Like a dog, the hair on the back of its neck raises up or it starts drooling or, your heart rate starts pumping or, there's all these different things that are going on and be like, it's another like body having a mind of its own. And then there'll be a moment in time where you're like even in our family, my daughter was like, that makes me feel funny. And I was like, isn't that weird? Isn't that weird that like we don't have any choice on how that makes us feel when we see different things? And what it does is it allows you, a lot of sex education is like, you got to talk to the kids about this at this age. When stuff comes up, and it doesn't matter if you've got a kid watching stuff early on, you know, you can introduce it earlier or later or however that pans out for you.
Well,
does that make any sense?
Well, it really does. And I feel bad because as a, you know, we've lost opportunity maybe for many of us parents. Like what would you tell parents who haven't planted necessarily those seeds of conversation? You know,
it's the same exact conversation. So what you're doing is you're just noticing things of yourself or in nature or anything like that. Just like, isn't it weird? Like this, they're even studying biology or whatever, just autonomic nervous system, and just be like, you know, I'm just so amazed at all the stuff that our bodies do without my permission. Isn't that interesting? It's these tiny little comments that you can make, or be like, yeah, I felt like I was going to laugh at that, you know, during a weird time when I shouldn't have, or my, you know, or sneezing or coughing or what, you know, whatever, just point it out. Be like, it's so weird that, like we don't always have control over our bodies. And then you can lead it in as it goes. You know, one of the things that I do, I talk like how to teach our kids about sexual predators from a very early age. And what we do with that is, again, we meet them where they're at. Humans identify with the natural world 100% quicker and easier, and it makes so much sense for them rather than our human social world. So with the predators, we talk about stalking, luring, and mimicking. And so the best way is to talk about it in regards to predatory animals. So you could go to the zoo or anything like that, and you can talk about like how the lions are stalking each other in the pen, or how the zookeeper is luring the rhino into, you know, its cage with something it wants, or like camouflage. The animals are pretending to be something they're not. And then as the kids get older, the conversation is like, remember how we talked about stalking, luring, and mimicking? Like, people can be predators too. And then you can legit take them to Cabela's or Bass Pro Shop and be like, look it, this is how humans are hunting. They're stalking, luring, and mimicking animals here. Like, people also hurt other people sometimes. And then when they go online, stalking, luring, and mimicking, is somebody pretending to be something they're not? Do they have the ability to stalk you? Are you giving too much information? Are they luring? Do they have something you want? Are they trying to lure you into something? So I
love that, because well, I think what made it, I mean, we're talking about those 5th grade muration, I'm hoping I'm saying that right, but videos that we all watch, and how uncomfortable that was, because it was just like thrown at us at a time that was like, where did that come from? And I remember one time my mom wanted to, you know, have a discussion with me about sex, and it was just so like, it was almost so formal and whatever, that it felt just weird, and it makes you, you know, you feel weird, and because I don't know, it just comes up at just odd times. But if you're already like building that relationship and making those connections for kids, that maybe it'll feel more natural and less like creepy. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, totally. And it's also about asking questions, or just, you know, having observations. You know, there's kind of this discovery into our world, and like, you know, and being honest, you know, sometimes we'll go to the mall and there's the Victoria's Secret, like huge wall of a woman, you know, in her underwear, and my daughter's staring at it. And I'm like, isn't it hard to look away? It's so hard to look away at people who don't have their clothes on, no matter where you're at. Like, the naked person is going to get the attention. Isn't that interesting? We're wired to look at other people, especially if they're behaving in a way that's not normal or socially acceptable. If that was an actual person in their underwear, they would be arrested.
That's interesting.
Potentially. Yeah, I mean, maybe not arrested, but like, there would be some serious questions being asked about why this woman is in lingerie standing in the mall. That would not be acceptable. Right?
Well, I think it's interesting too. Like if you have honest conversations and like you say, your daughter is staring at the Victoria's Secrets model, like some people would naturally, our world anymore, if our daughter is staring at another female, we might go, oh, well, maybe she's lesbian. I mean, you know what I mean? Like we're taking it a step further, but I think what you're saying is that it's all of us, no matter what sexual orientation we are, that we happen to be, like we may get sexually aroused at something that, like I said, another woman, looking at another woman or looking,
right.
And it has really nothing to do with, oh, I must be a lesbian. It's more like,
but this is what is so scary about right now, and why I'm, legit fighting really hard to have sex education just go back to some basic biology style of education, is because
next week, please check out the rest of our conversation with Emily Gaudreau in helping to de-pornify the youth culture.
Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind. Music featured in this episode from Scott Holmes. To learn more about our podcast, check us out at theluminousmind.net.